The 52-year-old white sheriff slammed his open palm across the 76-year-old black grandmother's face in front of 43 customers at Henderson's family restaurant on a quiet Sunday afternoon. The slap was loud enough that two waitresses dropped their trays in the kitchen. The sound of breaking dishes echoed through the dining room. The black grandmother's small wire-frame glasses flew off her face and skidded across the wooden floor under a nearby table. A small drop of blood appeared at the corner of her lower lip. She did not cry. She did not raise her hand to her cheek. She did not make a single sound. Sheriff Bobby Mason was the elected sheriff of Lincoln County, Mississippi. He had been the sheriff for 16 straight years. He stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed 275 pounds. The grandmother in front of him was barely 5 feet tall. She weighed 112 pounds. She had been quietly eating her Sunday lunch at table 7 when Sheriff Mason had walked into the restaurant 14 minutes earlier. He had spotted her sitting alone at her table. He had walked over. He had told her that she was sitting in the booth that he and his deputies normally used on Sunday afternoons after church. He had told her to move. The grandmother had quietly explained that the booth had been empty when she had arrived. She had asked if she could simply finish her meal and then leave. Sheriff Bobby Mason had not liked her answer. He had leaned over the table. He had told her that in Lincoln County, Mississippi, when a sheriff asks somebody to move, that somebody moves. He had used a word he should not have used. He had used it loud enough that everybody in the restaurant heard him. The grandmother had simply looked up at him with quiet, steady eyes. "Sheriff, sir, I am 80 years old next month. I worked 38 years as a school teacher in this county. I'm quietly eating my Sunday lunch. I'm not moving until I finish this plate." Sheriff Bobby Mason had then raised his hand, and he had slapped her. The black grandmother sat quietly with the small drop of blood at the corner of her lip. She did not pick up her glasses. She did not stand up. She just looked at Sheriff Mason with the same quiet, steady eyes. Then she said one short sentence. "Sheriff, you should not have done that, son." Sheriff Bobby Mason laughed loudly. None of the 43 customers in the dining room said a word. None of them stood up. None of them stopped him. 3 of them, however, were holding their cell phones under their tables. They had started recording the moment Sheriff Mason had walked over to her table. Sheriff Mason was not finished. He grabbed the grandmother's thin upper arm with his thick right hand. He pulled her up out of the booth. Her old scuffed shoes barely touched the wooden floor. He started to drag her toward the front door of the restaurant. And that was the exact moment the bell over the front door rang. A man in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit walked into Henderson's family restaurant. He was 48 years old. He was black. He was tall. He was carrying a small leather briefcase. He stopped 2 steps inside the door. He saw what was happening at table 7. He saw the elderly black woman being dragged toward the door. He saw the small drop of blood at the corner of her lip. He saw the small wire-frame glasses on the floor under a nearby table. The 48-year-old black man in the dark navy suit went very still. Sheriff Bobby Mason looked up. The cruel smile slowly disappeared from his thick red face. His grip on the grandmother's arm did not relax, but his eyes locked with the eyes of the man in the dark navy suit. And then Sheriff Mason's face went completely white. "Before this story breaks your heart and rebuilds it again, do me one small favor. If you believe the worth of an elderly grandmother is never measured by what a powerful man tries to do to her on a Sunday afternoon, hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. It costs you nothing. Now let's rewind. Because to understand who that man in the dark navy suit was, and why the sight of him made a 16-year sheriff in Mississippi go completely pale, you have to know exactly who the small black grandmother at table 7 really was. Her name was Mrs. Eunice Meade Jefferson. She was 76 years old. She had been born in 1949 in a small wooden house in rural Lincoln County, Mississippi. Her father had been a black sharecropper. Her mother had been a domestic worker for a wealthy white family. Eunice had grown up in segregated Mississippi during the worst years of Jim Crow. She had attended a small one-room schoolhouse for black children where there was sometimes only one textbook for 30 students. But Eunice had been blessed with a quiet, sharp mind. She had earned a scholarship to Tougaloo College in 1967. She had earned a master's degree in education in 1973. She had then spent the next 38 years teaching 2nd and 3rd grade at the same small public elementary school where she had once been a student herself. Eunice Jefferson had also raised one son, a quiet boy named Marcus who had grown up watching his mother grade papers at the kitchen table every single night until midnight. Marcus had been one of those quiet black boys who had never made trouble. He had earned straight A's. He had decided very young that he wanted to dedicate his life to the law. He had earned a scholarship to Howard University at the age of 17. He had then earned a law degree from Yale Law School. He had spent 18 years quietly working his way up through the federal court system. Then 6 years ago, Marcus Jefferson had been nominated by the President of the United States to serve as a federal district court judge. Marcus Jefferson was now the senior federal district judge for the Southern District of Mississippi, the most powerful federal judge in the entire state. The judge whose courtroom had jurisdiction over every single federal civil rights case in the southern half of Mississippi. He was now the man in the perfectly tailored dark navy suit, standing 2 steps inside the door of Henderson's family restaurant. He had driven down from his small office in Jackson that morning to take his elderly mother out to Sunday lunch. Judge Marcus Jefferson had been running about 20 minutes late because of road construction on the highway. He had walked into the restaurant expecting to find his mother quietly waiting for him in the booth where they always sat on Sundays. He had not expected to find her being dragged toward the front door by a county sheriff with the print of his open hand still red on her cheek. Eunice Jefferson had insisted on staying in her small house in Lincoln County after her husband Edward had passed away 11 years ago. Marcus had begged her to move to Jackson. Eunice had refused. "Marcus, baby, the good Lord blessed me with a small house in this county that I have lived in for 52 years. My church is around the corner. My garden is in the backyard. I'm not moving anywhere just because my son got a fancy new title in Jackson." Sheriff Bobby Mason had been the elected sheriff of Lincoln County for 16 years. He had a quiet pattern of harassing black residents in his county. The Federal Civil Rights Division at the U.S. Attorney's Office had been quietly tracking 47 separate complaints filed against him over the last 8 years. The most recent 11 of those complaints had landed in the courtroom of Judge Marcus Jefferson over the last 2 years. Judge Jefferson had read every single one of them. He had not been able to act on any of them yet because each individual complaint had failed to meet the legal threshold for a federal civil rights case. But he had been quietly waiting. The patterns had been there. The witnesses had been there. The evidence had simply not yet been strong enough to bring a single federal indictment. Sheriff Bobby Mason had also never connected the federal judge in Jackson with the elderly black grandmother who quietly ate Sunday lunch by herself at Henderson's family restaurant. He had never bothered to learn his last name. The judge's last name was Jefferson. The grandmother's last name was Jefferson. The connection had simply not been made by anybody who mattered in the small town. Now, in the middle of the dining room, Judge Marcus Jefferson had not moved. The cruel smile on Sheriff Mason's face was completely gone. His thick red face had turned white. His grip on Mrs. Eunice Jefferson's thin arm had loosened. The grandmother slowly pulled her arm free. She did not look at the sheriff. She just looked at her son. She smiled gently at him. "Marcus, baby, you are late for lunch." Sheriff Bobby Mason started to speak. His voice cracked. "Judge Jefferson, sir, I had no idea. This is some kind of mistake, please." Judge Marcus Jefferson did not move. He did not yell. He did not run to his mother. He simply looked at Sheriff Bobby Mason for a long, quiet moment. Then he set his small leather briefcase down on the wooden floor next to him. He pulled his cell phone out of the inside pocket of his suit jacket, and he made one phone call. The phone call lasted exactly 37 seconds. Judge Jefferson did not raise his voice once. "This is Judge Marcus Jefferson. I am calling from Henderson's family restaurant in Lincoln County. There is an active federal civil rights violation in progress. Sheriff Bobby Mason of Lincoln County has just physically assaulted a black female citizen in front of 43 witnesses. I have personally witnessed the aftermath. I need a federal civil rights team and 3 FBI special agents at this address within 60 minutes. The witnesses include 3 patrons with cell phone footage of the incident. I am also officially recusing myself from any future judicial proceedings related to this matter due to personal interest. The female citizen who was assaulted is my mother. Thank you." Judge Jefferson hung up the phone. Sheriff Bobby Mason was now visibly shaking. His 3 deputies were now backing slowly toward the door. Judge Jefferson finally walked across the dining room. He walked past the sheriff without looking at him. He stopped at table 7. He picked up his mother's small wire-frame glasses from the wooden floor under the nearby table. He gently cleaned them with a soft white handkerchief he pulled from his suit pocket. He carefully placed them back on his mother's face. Then he sat down quietly in the booth across from her. Eunice Jefferson smiled at her son. "You always were a good boy, Marcus." Marcus Jefferson smiled back. "Mama, are you hurt anywhere?" "I am fine, baby. The Lord protected me." Marcus Jefferson reached across the table and took his mother's thin old hand in his. "Mama, the man who just hit you is going to be arrested by federal officers within the hour. He is going to lose his job, he is going to lose his pension, and he is most likely going to spend the next 10 years in a federal prison. Are you okay with that, Mama? Or do you want me to ask the prosecutors to be lenient with him?" Eunice Jefferson thought about her 38 years of teaching second-grade black children in Lincoln County. She thought about how many of those black children had grown up to be afraid of the same Sheriff Bobby Mason who had just slapped her face on a Sunday afternoon. She squeezed her son's hand gently. "Marcus, baby, I do not want you to ask for leniency. I want you to make sure that no other grandmother in this county ever has to be afraid to eat her Sunday lunch alone again. Do whatever the law allows you to do. That is all." Within 60 minutes, 3 FBI special agents and 2 federal civil rights attorneys had arrived at Henderson's family restaurant. Sheriff Bobby Mason was placed under federal arrest in front of the same 43 customers who had watched him slap Mrs. Jefferson. He was charged with 3 federal civil rights violations. He was also charged with felony assault on an elderly person under Mississippi state law. His 3 deputies were placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Within 72 hours, the cell phone footage from the 3 patrons in the restaurant had been picked up by every major news network in the country. The video of an elderly black grandmother being slapped by a county sheriff, only to have a federal judge walk in 2 minutes later who turned out to be her son, became one of the most-watched civil rights videos of the year. Within 30 days, the U.S. Attorney's Office had reopened all 47 previous civil rights complaints filed against Sheriff Bobby Mason over the last 8 years. Within 90 days, Sheriff Mason had been formally indicted on 23 additional federal civil rights charges based on a pattern of behavior over the last 16 years. He was eventually convicted on 19 of those charges. He was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. He lost his sheriff's pension permanently. Henderson's family restaurant was sold to new ownership within 4 months of the incident. The new owner, a 46-year-old black businesswoman named Patricia Wells, repainted the entire restaurant. She replaced every single booth. She also installed a small bronze plaque near the front door of the restaurant. The plaque read, "Mrs. Eunice Me Jefferson, teacher, mother, grandmother, quietly sat in this booth on a Sunday afternoon and changed the county." 6 months after the incident, the state of Mississippi passed a new piece of legislation called the Eunice Jefferson Civil Rights Protection Act. The law required all county sheriff's departments in the state to install permanent body cameras on every deputy. It also required quarterly external civil rights audits of every sheriff's department in the state. The law had been drafted by a small team of state legislators who had personally watched the video of Sheriff Mason being arrested. The law passed the Mississippi State Senate by a vote of 41 to 10. Mrs. Eunice Jefferson was standing next to the governor when he signed the bill. Her son, Judge Marcus Jefferson, was standing beside her. Mrs. Eunice Jefferson refused all settlement offers from Lincoln County. Her son had then negotiated a much larger institutional settlement. The county had been required to fund a brand new civil rights training facility for all law enforcement officers in the southern half of Mississippi. The facility was named the Edward and Eunice Jefferson Civil Rights Education Center, after Mrs. Jefferson and her late husband. The training center is funded with $23 million from Lincoln County and the state of Mississippi. Every single new sheriff's deputy in the southern half of the state is now required to complete a 120-hour civil rights training program at the center before they are issued a badge. The opening session of every single training class begins with the same exact words from the lead instructor. "Officers, the first lesson I want to teach you today is one that an elderly black grandmother taught the entire state of Mississippi 6 years ago. She was sitting quietly at table 7 at Henderson's family restaurant on a Sunday afternoon. She had been a public school teacher in this county for 38 years. A sheriff with 16 years of experience walked over to her table. He told her to move. She politely refused. He hit her. He thought she was nobody. He did not know that her son was a federal judge. He did not know that his entire 16-year career was about to be taken away from him. Officers, the lesson is this. Every single grandmother sitting at every single table in every single county in this state is somebody. The day you decide that any one of those grandmothers is nobody is the day your career as a law enforcement officer is going to come to an end. So here is what I want to leave you with tonight. Sheriff Bobby Mason spent 16 years harassing black residents of Lincoln County, Mississippi, because he believed nobody would ever stop him. He did not know that a small, elderly black grandmother who quietly ate Sunday lunch by herself at Henderson's family restaurant had spent 38 years quietly raising the federal judge who would eventually preside over the legal undoing of his entire career. Eunice Jefferson did not need to fight Sheriff Mason herself. She had quietly raised the answer to him at her own kitchen table in 1980. And on a Sunday afternoon 45 years later, that answer walked into Henderson's family restaurant in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit and made a 16-year sheriff go pale in front of 43 witnesses. Think about the Eunice Jeffersons in your community right now. The quiet, older black grandmothers who taught second grade for 38 years and who quietly raised the very federal judges, prosecutors, and senators we now depend on to fix our broken systems. The grandmothers who refused to move out of their small houses just because their famous children offered to buy them bigger ones. The women whose worth has been measured for 70 years by the simplicity of their old wireframe glasses instead of the magnitude of who they raised at their kitchen tables. The world has been wrong about them for generations. If this story moved you tonight, do me one final favor. Smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. And drop a comment below telling me about a Eunice in your own life. The quiet grandmother whose son or daughter became somebody the world would eventually have to bow down to. Because the world is full of grandmothers raising the answers to the very men who have spent their careers oppressing them. And the only question that matters tonight is whether we are humble enough to honor those grandmothers long before we ever find out exactly who their children turned out to become. See you in the next story.